Hello, English 100 students. This is Dr. Erin Williams again with another brief presentation for you guys. This is for week 6, lesson 1. And we're still talking a little bit about Kathryn Schall's argument, her essay about wrongness. I wonder what you guys are thinking about this. I've seen some of what you've put on the discussion board so far. Congratulations to Stephanie for being our first poster with a very interesting post. Made me think about whether Schall's has got an argument about are people ever wrong or not? So, very good stuff. I hope that the rest of you guys will get to that lesson pretty soon because the paper is coming right up. And you'll want to be kind of sharing your ideas with the rest of the class about what arguments are being presented here. The more arguments we can get together as a class on that discussion board, the more you can have to choose from when you're writing the paper. Maybe the argument you post in the discussion board isn't the one that you end up writing the paper about. It doesn't have to be that way. So the more high quality argument analyses we can get on the discussion board, the better it will be for everyone. Alright, so today what I'd like to do is take a closer look at some of Schall's main arguments, because I'd like for your papers to focus in on some of the more important sub-claims or sub-arguments, that she's making throughout the paper. So, in order to understand some of what Schall's is saying about wrongness, and the title of her essay is Two Models of Wrongness, we kind of have to start with what we think her definition of wrongness is. So, I've summarized it like this. She seems to be talking about mistakes, errors, and misapprehension and misperception as all examples of wrongness. But I don't know that I ever saw a really specific definition of wrongness, and I think this is just, this is my take as a reader who's trying to be critical or not just accept whatever everybody says. I'm wondering if having a very clear definition of wrongness would be helpful for her essay, because I found myself wondering pretty often, well, is error wrongness in every case? Is making a mistake the same thing as being wrong? I wonder. So then she talks about misapprehension and misperception as being wrong. So here she's just kind of drawing parallels. We talk about people who are insane as being wrong about the world. Okay, well then, if you're wrong about the world, you're seen as being kind of crazy. And she does the same thing for being high. If you're wrong about the world, you must have lost your mind. You must be high. And while I see the connection, I don't know that that fits her definition of wrongness in the same way. I don't know that she needs it to. She's just trying to get us to realize that we think about wrongness as being something really, really dreadful and bad and all that. At any rate, what I want you to do as you're looking back through this essay is to keep in mind that some of the principles of academic reading are to read critically. Do not just accept what you read. So, for example, I found myself asking the question as I read, do I agree that this is the proper way to define wrong or wrongness? What issues might I take with Schall's definition? As you've been hearing me discuss, I think that she could have benefited from, or the essay could have benefited from, a more clear definition of wrongness, and one that would have united mistakes, errors, and misapprehension and misperception more clearly than they are right now. Alright, so that's kind of how she's talking about wrongness. She looks more specifically at two models of wrongness. And again, this is just according to her. You don't have to agree with her right now. You don't have to say she's right. This is just what she's presenting. And as a critical reader, I know I need to understand that before I can agree or disagree. So she's got the pessimistic model in opposition to the optimistic model. In the pessimistic model, we're being pessimistic about being wrong. So there are a few things that we don't like about being wrong if we adopt the pessimistic model of wrongness. We think if we have a pessimistic view of wrongness, we think that being wrong makes us feel inferior and dumb, and so because of those social pressures, we're afraid of being wrong. And if you want more information about that, she talks about that on pages 392 through 394. She also looks at how sometimes we think that being wrong separates us from God. That seems to be a more old school notion. She talks about that on page 405 some. And being wrong shows how inferior we are. She mentions that on page 395. So we'll never reach the heights of God. All right, well, of course we won't, but that's in the pessimistic model, this is how we feel about being wrong. It just shows how far from God we are, and so it's not something we should want. We should not want to be wrong. Another characteristic, being wrong is dangerous, humiliating, distasteful, and unfun. That's on page 394. That obviously connects with the first characteristic I noted, right? It's humiliating. We're afraid of being wrong because of the social pressures. It's distasteful. It's just not something that is appropriate to social contexts. You should want to be right. And being wrong is dangerous. If you're wrong, you might cost somebody their life, and that's certainly true. Right? Or sometimes it's just unfun. It's just not a good feeling to have. And she connects it with insanity and misapprehending the world. And so we shouldn't want those things. We shouldn't want to be crazy, so we shouldn't want to be wrong. And she's saying that those are the kind of negative views of wrongness. But she wants to suggest that there's a different way to view wrongness, one that's more productive, and she calls this the optimistic model. This is the model that she prefers and advocates for. What are its characteristics? Somewhat, she would say, error happens to everyone, so that makes it okay. Everyone is wrong from time to time. So here she's admitting that everyone is wrong sometimes. And in fact, here's the second characteristic, that makes error natural. Sometimes it's even beneficial, she goes so far as to say. It's at least not something to fear. After all, everyone is wrong sometimes. They just have to kind of embrace that and look for how error can be useful instead. Right, so just to be clear, Scholes is not saying that no one's ever wrong. She is saying everyone's wrong, and that makes it more okay than we usually think. All right, since it's not something to fear and it's natural and it can even be beneficial, we cannot eradicate it, nor should we try to. And she even lists 3 problems with trying to eradicate error, and those are covered on pages 396 through 397. And we shouldn't try to get rid of error, it's just part of the human experience. As a result, she says, error leads to progress. By getting things wrong sometimes, we learn how to improve them. Now, me as a critical reader, I think that she's maybe too quick to say being wrong is great. So I'm going to wonder about, well, how is this so great? She uses the scientific method as an example of how wrongness or error can lead to progress. This is an example of the optimistic model of wrongness. Right. What's her main claim about how the scientific method is an example of the optimistic model of wrongness? I find her claim is on 398 about this particular sub-argument. I think her claim is this: as an ideal of intellectual inquiry and a strategy for the advancement of knowledge, the scientific method is essentially a monument to the utility of error. All right. So in other words, this is her main claim that she needs to have support for, that the scientific method is essentially a monument, or a very good example, a fantastic example, an important example, a monument, to the utility, or the use, the beneficial nature of error. So she's got support and reasoning for this. So I'm using the terms from the textbook to show you how the argument stacks up. So, what's her support for this? She says, scientists gravitate toward falsification. They seek to disprove their beliefs. In other words, they're not interested in being right up front. They want to know that they can be proven wrong. So she goes on to say, in fact, not only can any given theory be proven wrong, sooner or later oh no, I have a typo. Sooner or later it probably will be. All right. So, I guess that's an example of wrongness and error, my typo. At any rate, so she's got this, she's using as support this notion that we have the scientific method. It's focused on being wrong. That's that toward falsification aspect right here. And not only is it focused on being wrong, it's actually focused on, it's sort of based on this notion that any given theory probably will be proven wrong. And then she goes on to say, when it is proven wrong, it will mark the success of science, not its failure. So this is how it becomes a monument. It is a success, not a failure. Right. So it's based on being wrong, and in being wrong, it actually moves us toward success. All right, how does she connect all this support to her claim? How does she synthesize her point? Here's her reasoning. She says, in this model of wrongness, having to do with the scientific method, errors do not lead us away from the truth. Instead, they edge us incrementally toward it. So piece by piece, as we disprove one theory and disprove another theory and disprove another theory, we're headed toward the truth. Because if I've disproved one theory, then I found out something to replace it. In other words, I can test whether gravity is reality. I can test whether I can put scientific theories to the test, and if they don't hold up to the test, then that tells me something about the way the world really works, not just the way I think it does. All right. That's all well and good, but I'm a critical reader, and it seems to me that this is actually an argument for the utility of correctness, not the utility of error. After all, what the scientific method is, from my point of view, what the scientific method is focused on is not being wrong and being wrong and being wrong, but instead on finding new truth. The scientific method isn't there to show us new ways to be wrong. It's there to help us get toward the truth, just as she says in her reasoning, or in her synthesis of how the support matches up with her claim. And so I'm going to make a suggestion based on my critique. Perhaps by adjusting the claim, Schulz can make the most of her support for the evidence. So in other words, it seems like what she has to say about the scientific method makes it more about the truth. And if we remember her claim, that seems to be more about error or wrongness. And what I'm saying is, if she adjusted this claim to talk about the utility of correctness and how error can lead to correctness, she'd have an argument that makes more sense. So that's just an example of one take on Schulz's argument and one of its important sub-arguments, and a critical reading of that argument. like you'll do for the paper.